Okay, so let's go and look at some of the other functions. Let's go back to the sculpture here. And when you go in by default, you have the cube shape. That's just the default. There's all these different shapes that you can use. There are two shapes that are really worth taking a look at in particular. And one is the pyramid shape. And the reason that these are worth, actually, you know what? Let's back up. Let me go back to the square. We're going to cut out what I just said.
Oh.
Because I actually want to start new. We go in here and we have the square shape by default.
Okay.
And where we left off, we had the stamp shape, and so we actually still have that equipped. I'm going to go back to smear because that's the default. And I'm going to close my menu up there, and I'm going to edit the shape. And the shortcut is L1 and square. And now we go in here, and the shape just sort of sits there. And we have option to change the looseness if we want to. That's always something that you can change later in the tweak menu.
Can you show us an example of what looseness means?
So if I take the looseness and I crank it all the way up.
Get loose within that.
I'm having a little trouble.
Yeah, just
there we go.
There it is.
So see how it gets all loose and floppy that way. And I personally prefer to do most of my looseness work after the fact in the tweak, but there is an option here which is varying looseness, and that is interesting because it will allow you to have a different looseness in your surface than your cutaways. But that's maybe something that people would want to watch Kareem's stream on Move controllers, where he also talks about styles, because he gets into varying looseness in there, and Johnny gets into varying looseness in the rock tutorial as well.
Nice.
I may have been wrong about Kareem saying that in the stream. In that stream, it might just be rocks, the rock tutorial.
Sure.
So we have some options here. We can make it into sections, which with a cube, the sections are not all that interesting unless you use a hole as well. And so now we have a cutaway, and now you can see you get kind of an interesting shape happening there. You can also go down to a 1/4, and then it goes back to a 1.
Okay. That'd be great for making rooms or simple storage units.
It's it's good for making rooms and a lot of different things. It's also something you can cut away into a shape later, but sometimes you want that shape to be inherent.
And it retains the memory of the cuts that you make, right? Is that something that we will discuss later?
It does, yeah. Let's look at cuts with the stamp tool. Let's go over to the stamp tool real quick here and look at cuts, because we can make cuts with a smear or a stamp, but the stamp tool has some other features that I want to show. So I'm going to go and reset just to the default cube just by clicking on cube again here. And now I'm in the stamp tool, and if I go into my shape edit menu here, I now have another thing which is blend amount. And now when I crank that up, watch how it merges. I'll turn the camera here a little bit. It merges with that shape next to it, and that's what the blending is. And you have the same thing with the hole and the section that you can do. But let's look at the cutaway, which is the shortcut is triangle, and you can also get to it from your menu up here in the add and subtract feature. So right now I have the blend is still turned way up. I'm going to go back into editing the shape, and
park that shape right there, and then you go into the edit.
Right, and now I can move the camera all around it. I can also stretch the shape and move it, stretch the sides of it like this.
It just looks like a cozy little nook in like the back of a bus or something.
It could just be a little bench seat right there. I can turn the blend amount back down or crank it up, and I can toggle the hard blend, which gives you a blend, but it's angular. Or I can turn the blend back down. But if I turn off the hard blend, now we have that, that rounded shape. And while we're in here, I can turn on the varying looseness. And now when I crank this up, see how it's just the cutaway that's the loose part, but it's not changing anything else in the shape for the varying looseness. So that's an interesting thing, but for most of the time that's maybe a little bit more of an advanced technique.
Cool.
But just stamping and blending, it's important to remember that the blend is only a feature in the stamp tool. It's not a feature in the smear tool. So there's no,
So planning ahead.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. And sometimes you want to smear and sometimes you want to stamp, but if you need that soft blend, then you have to stamp. If I go back into additive rather than subtractive mode, and now I have my looseness turned way up here, I turn it back down so you can see the cube a little bit better. And now you can see that blending happening the same way here. Turn it all the way up and you get that to happen. Another thing that we should look at in the sculpt mode, in the tools, is the spray paint feature. And people might confuse the spray paint with the paint mode. The spray paint is a tool that's within the sculpt mode. It's not part of paint mode. People can find this. I'm going to cancel out of there. So I'm going to choose a different color because we won't see anything happen unless I choose a different color. Something really contrasty, like a nice dark blue. And now I'm bringing my spray paint here. I'm going to go into edit. I still have the soft blend turned up because that's the last way that I left it. If I turn it all the way down, we've got a hard shape. And then you can see, you can also do the same thing with the hole.
Oh my goodness.
And you can change how many sides there are. But we'll just leave it sort of normal there. Opacity is a feature here, so you can make it a very light tint,
Oh, nice.
or you can make it stronger. The soft blend is quite neat. So again, this is the spray paint tool. And the spray paint, you could set it up like that and be really precise and change the size of your box. You can change the size and shape of your box here. You can use the up and down directional buttons to just make the whole thing bigger. And you can just hit this and say stamp in place and you just get one mark. But you also can smear it the same way as the smear tool. So I could go change my angle here a little bit and smear across.
Oh my god.
Or I could paint the whole thing if
Okay.
I want to.
That's the spray paint, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm gonna
Wow.
just undo that so we can see those changes a little bit more. So that's actually not all the tools. There's a couple more tools that I could show in here, but I'm gonna jump back over to the paint for a minute here. And we covered all of these different tools. The paint actually has fewer tools than the sculpt mode. And there is no spray paint function within the paint tool. So if you want to add to your painting, you can just use the brush flex, the draw flex, or the stamp. And we didn't really look at the brush editor in paint mode. So if we go in here and we look at the brush editor, this is the stamp tool. We have in stamp, there's fade, which is kind of like the blending mode in the sculpt tool. So it gives you this faded out edge. And I'm going to turn that back down. And then there's also scatter, which gives you that kind of an effect.
Right.
And opacity, that's always an option with the paint tool. If we go back over to the brush flex or the draw flex, both of these have basically the same menu. There's no fade option when you're brushing or drawing, but there is a scatter option. You can still scatter, and you don't really see it until you start to draw with it. But you can see that now it's much more sort of big and blotchy than what I did before. That's because of the scatter.
Okay.
So there's fewer tools, and there's no spray painting feature within the paint mode.
Interesting.
But you can see when I had the scatter turned on, I started to get some color variations as opposed to just the original pink color.
Right.
I still had the same pink selected, but then the scatter, because it's changing the perspective on the flecks that are being used, it's giving you these different color changes.
Right, and a texture too, it seems like.
And a
Or
texture.
maybe it's just showing the texture more.
It does. By default, the paint shows the texture more than the sculpt. And let's look at a couple more things in the sculpt, and then we'll sort of look at the textures as well.
So, the gradient on the sculpture
Yes.
is immaculate. The gradient on the paint, is there a way to get a sort of equivalent if you like laid out a span of paint and you wanted to get a similar sort of
You
gradient?
don't know. You're not going to get quite the same
Okay.
gradient on a painting as a sculpture.
That makes sense, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a little bit different, and
Right.
they serve different functions. So
Right.
the painting tool, it's a very certain look, and in a few minutes we're going to get into also the different features that it has in the tweak menu that make it really a unique tool also.
Nice.
But when you want something that has this airbrushed look, you actually want to have a sculpture with a spray paint on it. The paint tool itself doesn't give you
Okay.
that
So
same
if you-
airbrush quality.
Right. So if you wanted to make like a faux spray painted wall in a 3D level,
You would use the
you
sculpt
just-
mode, and you
yeah.
would make the wall, and then you would
then you
airbrush
literally
tool
airbrush
onto
it.
it.
Yeah.
Yes,
That's
yes,
pretty
that's
bad,
exactly what you would do.